section at the Department of Psychology welcomes you to the John Kendall Lecture Series this year. This lecture series has been endowed in President John Kendall's name. John was a chair and longtime member of this department when I came, and when many of us were here. He was a master storyteller, a master teacher of the intro psych class, and a lover of ideas. He was someone who was always excited by ideas in many different disciplines, and I think this year he would be especially proud that the person that we've invited for this lecture is Gustavus, and somebody else whose work crosses disciplines and whose work, I think, is about big questions and ideas. Dr. Kathleen Vohs is our guest this evening. She has many accomplishments. I'm going to try to be very brief because I think the excitement that you're going to catch from just listening to ideas generated from her as rapidly as you could possibly take them in is going to be, I think, the experience of this talk. Kathleen was a student of ours and graduated in 1996, got her PhD at Dartmouth College, went on to a postdoc at Case Western Reserve, I guess spent a year in Utah after that, then went to take a job in the psychology, or at least interview for a job at the psychology program at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, and was hijacked by the business program there. They came and heard her talk and said, oh, no, we think that maybe you really belong in the business school where we're doing marketing. And so she was there for several years very productively, and is now at the Carlson School of Management, where she's a McKnight Fellow, one of 5, I think, that they award to outstanding faculty members there, and is currently the Land O'Lakes Professor of Marketing. Yeah. And she's going to be someone that, when I say internationally famous, and she tells us that she's traveling 180,000 miles a year to conferences and talks. It seems like when we want to see her for dinner, just to keep track, she's gone all the time somewhere. And so we're really delighted that she was willing to make one of those stops to talk about her research here at Gustavus. So without any further ado, and again, I want to emphasize with great pride and with great affection.
Can you hear me? You can hear me, good. What an honor and a delight, and one of the nicest introductions that I've ever received. So thanks so much for inviting me to be the Kendall Lecturer for 2011. And I want to say a few words first about the psychology department here at Gustavus. The psychology department played a fundamental role in where I am today. And in particular, I want to single out 2 people. The first is Dick Martin, Professor Martin. And Dick is important to me because his warmth and caring and supportive nature is one of these things that can just nourish an individual through those tough times in life. And then I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Kruger. And it is without a doubt that because of his influence, his patience, intellectual stimulation, a little bit of prodding, a little bit of pushing, that my academic studies and therefore my career and therefore truly my life was changed. So thank you so, so much. And it is just an honor to be here with you all. I'm going to tell you today about the research that I do on the psychology of money. And I hope, as Kruger alluded to in the introduction, that really it stimulates in you a lot more than just, oh, there's these maybe interesting findings out there. I hope it changes the way you think about money, the way people use it, and how people's behaviors are influenced in very big ways by these little tiny reminders of money. And I hope it stirs in you some questions that then we can talk about at the end here of my talk. And so the talk today is very simply about how very small reminders of money produce very big changes in people's behavior. So it turns out when you want to study the psychology of money, you really don't have to have a long reading list because there is none. There are 2 theories that I really hit upon that were explaining the way that I was seeing money reminders have effects on people's behavior. And let me explain to you what they are and then how they inform my research. And so the first theory I'll point to is this one by a sociologist. His name is Alan Fisk. And Alan Fisk studies how people relate to one another. And by that, I really mean just the way they have interactions with each other. And he said that if you look across relationships all around the globe, and throughout the course of human history, there's 4 fundamental ways that humans relate to one another. It's outside the bounds of this talk to describe them all, but it turns out one is really important for today's talk, and it's called market pricing mode. And Fisk said that when people are in market pricing mode, their psychology is such that they're thinking in terms of quantitative elements. They're doing analytical style of thought. They're thinking in terms of ratios. And they're kind of like these little economists. They're thinking in terms of supply and demand and in terms of benefits and costs. And the canonical or prototypical example of when people are in market pricing mode is when they're using money. And so we can understand that when people are in market pricing mode and using money, they're going to be highly analytical. But what really became important, and actually, sorry guys, I'm going to pause this and put this down. It's kind of beeping, isn't it? Sorry, everybody. Can you still hear? Yay, I think that's going to be better. Nope, whatever. So Fisk said, when people are in market pricing mode, one thing that they're really, really bad at is they're really bad at being in relationships. And essentially, what he says is that there's this other mode of relating called communal mode. And in communal mode, the motto is, take what you need, give what you can. And so best friends are in communal mode. Lovers, romantic partners are in communal mode. Well, at least they're all supposed to be. Siblings and parent-child relationships, these are characterized by communal mode. And what Fisk said is that when people are in market pricing mode, this is diametrically opposed to them being in communal mode. And so from that, I drew upon this idea that when people are reminded of money, they might not be very good at relationships. A second theory is actually directly about money. And it is a theory that's called basically money as a tool, money as a drug. So it's the second one up here. And in this theory, they outline the history of money and what role it's played in human progression in societies. And from that, I took the idea that money is essentially about getting people's wants and needs satisfied. Okay, that might sound really elementary, but when you think about what that means is that when you have a want or a need, that means you have a goal. And I came to think that when people are reminded of money, this might be something that heightens their pursuit of their own goals. Because when you're using money to get what you want and what you need, you're in goal-striving mode. We also know from this money as a tool, money as a drug idea, that people should be using money as if it's the ultimate tool. So that's that idea of getting your wants and needs satisfied. It's a tool, and it helps you achieve things in life. And that's how people should behave towards money, said these authors. But then they correctly pointed out that that's actually not how people behave towards money whatsoever. They behave as if money is a drug. They get it, they want more, they get more, and it has these strong addictive properties. Now, addictive properties is probably too extreme of a phrase really to use, but from that I took this idea that money is, in a sense, kind of the ultimate motivator. So you get two converging sets of evidence from this money as a tool, money as a drug paper, suggesting that when people are reminded of money, they might become very, very motivated to achieve their own goals. So we formed these twin hypotheses that are essentially what I just told you, that on the one hand, that when people are reminded of money, they might be very good at goal pursuit, and especially about things that are directly related to their own personal goals. Because remember, money is used to get your own personal wants and needs satisfied. As a perhaps unintended consequence of being in this goal-motivated orientation, people are not very good at social interactions. And in particular, we can draw from that market pricing mode work to say that when people are reminded of money, they might not be very socially sensitive, not very communally oriented. So we named our theory the self-sufficiency theory of money, and we chose this term for two reasons. The self-sufficiency term, as you know just from its lay use, has one angle that's decidedly positive, and it sounds perhaps like being goal-oriented. And so in psychology, you'll see scholars use the term self-sufficiency to mean, kind of as you're all thinking, the ability to perform a task without the aid or help from others. And so you'll see this being used in the literature on post-injury recovery. We'd say that a patient performed self-sufficiently when he walked down the hall without the use of crutches. Okay? That's a very positive connotation to this term self-sufficiency. But it also turns out that the term self-sufficiency has a second meaning in the psychological literature, and it's when clinicians and psychotherapists use the term self-sufficiency, they're talking about a person who is resistant to intimacy, doesn't want people to rely on him or her, and certainly doesn't want to rely on other people. And you see clinicians use this term when they're talking about someone typically with narcissistic personality disorder. And so I thought, okay, this is perfect, this is great, because the same term kind of nicely encapsulates what we were seeing in the lab. On the one hand, you can perform tasks and behaviors on your own without the help of others. So that's a kind of goal-oriented, motivated component. But on the other hand, when people are self-sufficient, they resist intimacy and they don't want to be dependent on others. So the theory is called the self-sufficiency theory of money. And now I'm going to take you into the experiments that we've performed in my lab and all across the world that help me understand the psychology of money and bring me to where I am today. And in particular, we're going to talk about money and helping, both in terms of how reminders of money lead people to be more or less helpful, or lead people to be more or less desiring of help for themselves. We're also then going to talk about how reminders of money change the way that people deal with social interactions generally. And in particular, we're going to see we set up circumstances in which we want to know if people want to be alone or they want to be with other people. I'll later talk about money and egocentrism, which means only seeing things from your own perspective, your own point of view, and not really being able to see things as other people might see them. And then the last, I will review some of the research we've done on money and the experience of pain. So with that, let me tell you about the work that we do. So this first experiment is about giving help. We wanted to understand, are people reminded of money more or less helpful to others? So in this experiment, what would happen is subjects come into the lab individually, where they're met by a confederate. I know that some of you know what a confederate is, but for those of you who don't, a confederate is someone who works for the laboratory, typically posing as another subject in the experiment. So here, our naive subject and our confederate come together, and the experimenter says that today's experiment is about personality types and how they play games. And we're interested, in fact, in economic type games. And so the experimenter sits the two of them down and asks them to play the game of Monopoly. It turns out we don't care how they play the game of Monopoly. We don't videotape them. That's simply there to provide the context for what happens next. They play the game for a few minutes, and the experimenter comes in and says, oh, okay, now you two are going to be doing different tasks. Why don't you, points to the confederate, go across the hall, there's some questionnaires on your desk. She says to the real subject, I'm going to get you your next task in just a moment, and she starts cleaning up the Monopoly game. Now this is the point where we start the manipulation of how strongly people are reminded of money. And so if our subjects had been randomly assigned to a high money condition, as she cleans up the game, she leaves some of the money from the Monopoly game on the table, and she leaves $4,000 in the high money condition. Now if our subjects had been randomly assigned to the low money condition, she leaves $200 on their table. And if they've been randomly assigned to the control condition, she cleans up the entire game of Monopoly. And so for these participants, that idea of money should be decaying in their mind. They are going to not be reminded of money very soon after. She leaves them to fill out some filler questionnaires, so some questionnaires that we're not that interested in, but she has them there, and then our people are differentially exposed to this idea of money. What happens next is that she comes into the lab and she says, you know, the lab is really, really busy today, and we're actually going to need this room for something else. I'm going to have you come with me. And as she walks the participant, she walks across kind of a big open space where my research assistants are working entering data. And they pass a second confederate who's holding a bunch of office supplies in her hands. And she has there a manila envelope full of little tiny golf pencils, and the confederate drops the bag of golf pencils right in front of the subject. And we wanted to test how many pencils does the subject help her pick up. And we see that when subjects had earlier, 10 minutes earlier, had been sitting in a room in which there was $4,000 of monopoly money, they were not helpful to the Confederate relative to their counterparts in different conditions. And so here you see that when subjects were in the high money condition, they were the least helpful. When subjects were in the control condition here, they were the most helpful. And our low money condition statistically was not distinguishable from these two. So the mean here is not statistically different from this nor this. So we had initial evidence that when people were reminded of money, really strongly reminded of money, they're less helpful. This experiment, while it was exciting to us, had some other interpretations, so we wanted to do it in another way. And in particular, it's not clear to me that when you're a subject in a psychology experiment and you're walking across a room, it's not really clear to me that it's your job as a subject to be picking up pencils. You know, I mean, it's nice to be helpful, but it could be that when people are really reminded of money, really strongly reminded of money, that their head's kind of in the clouds. And so we wanted to provide a context in which our subjects reminded of money were very, very, very aware that somebody needed help. So that's this experiment. So now, in this experiment, subjects come into the lab individually, and they sit down, and we tell them that we're interested in the way that people think about language as it naturally occurs. And we give them a word puzzle. So if our subjects have been randomly assigned to the neutral condition, we would ask them to take 5 words, and then remove one of them to make a sensible phrase. So in these 5 words, we might have them descramble this to, it is cold outside. Being a good Minnesotan, I always include some items about being cold or winter. If our subjects have been randomly assigned, however, to the money condition, we're going to have them doing phrases that are going to remind them of money. And so in this phrase in particular, you would descramble it to a high-paying salary. Other phrases in this task would be $100 bill, or she paid the rent, or he found a check. So we have some people reminded of money through this word puzzle, and some people not. What happens next is the experimenter comes in the room and says, it's really, really busy in the lab today, and I'm going to have to put this other subject here in the room with you to do another experiment that she's doing. Really, this woman is a Confederate. She works for the lab, and she sits in a little tiny room with the real subject. Now, the experimenter says, you know, I'm so busy today. We actually have 2 more experiments running down the hall, and I'm going to have to go away for a while. Work on the things you're supposed to be working on, and I guess if you have any questions, you can just ask each other. But just sit tight. Don't leave until I come back. I'll be back in a few minutes. And so she leaves. She gives them permission to talk to one another, but what subjects do is they just kind of work on their own tasks. And after a minute, the Confederate looks at the subject and says, can you help me? I don't understand what they want me to do here. This is not clear to me. And it's a task like this. And so it's like a search a word, but with numbers. It's not that hard to figure out what to do. But the subjects, well, some of them do, start explaining how to think about it and how to do it. And the Confederate was very well trained to continue to feign confusion for a period of time, at which point the subjects would ultimately say, I don't really know anymore. I can't explain anymore. And what we wanted to test and we wanted to measure, and we did, is how long the subjects were helping the Confederate as a sign of how helpful they would be towards her. So this is what we see. Now, in a situation in which the subjects clearly know that she needs help, we still see once again that reminders of money led people to be less helpful to someone. In this case, it was a confused peer. So now we had a series of experiments, and some others I'm not showing you, suggesting that when people are reminded of money, they're less helpful to someone else. And then we would have these lab meetings and we would think, okay, this is all very interesting, but what if people reminded of money are happy to be helpful, but they just want to be helpful in terms of giving money? So we thought, okay, we needed to be testing this. And so what we did is we brought people into the lab for an experiment in which we're ultimately going to measure charity donations. So subjects come into the lab and we tell them, once again, the lab is really, really busy. And you know, the last experiment that we ran here, we paid people for their performance using quarters. So that's actually all we have left today. So we give them a $2 payment in quarters. And it turns out the reason that we actually do this is because later we're going to want them, we're going to give them an opportunity to donate. We want to make sure, A, that they have money, and B, we want to make sure that they have a nice range of monetary units to be able to donate. Because if you just gave them $2 bills, then statistically it just gets a little less likely for you to be able to determine whether there's an effect there. So we wanted to give our subjects 8 quarters so they'd have a nice range of quarters to be able to donate if they so felt like it. Then the subject come in and they do one of the 2 tasks that I just talked about before, the word descramble task. They do a series of other questionnaires, and at the end, the experimenter says, that's it. Yeah, I'm sorry, this experiment's a little bit boring. This lab is interested in correlating and cross-correlating different personality measures with one another. And by this time, the subject's eyes are glazed over and they don't really care. And she says, so you know that's actually it? She says, you can go ahead and get your book bag, get your coat. Oh, and by the way, we are taking donations for the University Student Fund, and there's a box in the back if you'd like to donate. This technique is called a false debriefing because our subjects think the experiment is over, and that we really collect the dependent measure after that. It's a sweet technique, but you can only use it once a year, once every 5 years, people catch on. So now our subjects think the experiment is over, they're collecting their things, and they have an opportunity privately to donate money if they so desire. We measure how much money our subjects donated. And now you see that it's not the case that people reminded of money want to be helpful with their money. That's not it. People reminded of money are still less helpful when it comes to donating their money. And so here you see that if our subjects had been reminded of money via that descrambling task, they gave about 75 cents of the money that they'd just been paid. Whereas our subjects in the no money condition, a neutral condition, they gave about $1.30. That's quite a large difference in how much they're donating, and by that point, how helpful they're being. So now you're probably all thinking, okay, this is interesting maybe, but I mean, doesn't this just show that money makes people selfish, and don't we already know that? And so recall though that we have a theory, a very specific theory, and it's called the self-sufficiency theory. We didn't think so. So we didn't think that people reminded of money were just gonna fall into this pattern of being purely selfish. And we decided to test requests for help as something that would help us understand this. Because, you know, we were thinking, if you're a selfish person, then when other people need help, you're not going to be helpful. But when you need help, yep, first thing, come help me. But we think that people reminded of money move into this really self-sufficient mode, which is, yeah, I don't want to help you, but then again, I don't need help either. I'm fine, I'm going to do this on my own. And so we wanted to test in a series of experiments how people reminded of money would deal with situations in which they were kind of tough, but they could ask for help. So in this experiment, we used the descrambling task as you'd seen before. So people reminded of money via a cognitive task, or people not reminded of money via a similar cognitive task. And then we gave our subjects the following problem. This is a problem from cognitive psychology, and it's called an insight problem. Insight problems are interesting to use in the lab because they have the special quality of being solvable, but while you're working on them, it doesn't feel as if things are making actually any progress. This is a famous cognitive insight problem called the 9-dot problem, and the goal here for our subjects, and anybody who tries it, is to take your pencil and using 4 straight lines and never picking your pencil up, can you connect all 9 dots? Just 4 lines, never picking your pencil up, 4 straight lines. And it turns out that people work on this for a while, and sometimes people just won't get it. But if you work on it for some period of time, usually the answer comes in sort of an aha moment at the end. Now we were going to then give our subjects this task and tell them that your job is to work on this task, and you can work on it for as long as you wish. If you get stuck, because some people get stuck, if you need any tips or any help, you can ask the experimenter who's sitting right outside the door. So now we measured how long people work when help is available. And we see that when people are reminded of money, they work longer and harder at this difficult task, even though help is available right outside the door, relative to people who've not been reminded of money. So they're quicker to ask for help. So this was helping us support the self-sufficiency hypothesis of money. We wanted to do it again, of course, as a replication to see whether we really understood what was going on. In this experiment, we got our subjects to think about money in a slightly different way than what I've described already. So half of the subjects stand in front of a video camera and make a videotape while reading aloud a passage ostensibly written by someone else at the university. So the passage for people in the high money condition was about life growing up in quite an affluent family. This essay talked about trips around the world, talked about having lots of money and never having to worry about where money was going to come from. Our other half of the subjects are reading an essay out loud in front of a video camera, but this time they're reading one written by a student who grew up with, as we put it in the essay, who grew up with enough money, but just enough. So the student wasn't poor, but the student definitely wasn't rich. So this person lived on adequate financial resources. Relative to the other condition, we call this a low money condition. We now gave our subjects this task. This task is an impossible task, but we can frame this and we can show them sample tasks that look like this that are in fact solvable. Similar to what I described to you before, the goal with this task is to take one's pencil, start at any one of the points on this figure, move your pencil up and down throughout all the line segments so that you cross all of them, but none of them twice. And so, as I mentioned, you can give sample items that look similar to this that are in fact solvable to get the subjects to practice on, and then you let them loose on a couple unsolvable ones. We once again then said that they can ask for help. Now this time we changed the circumstance. We brought in someone that we said was another subject in an experiment, so it's a peer, and we said that this subject had actually just performed the experiment that the real subject is in. The experimenter said that she had to go down the hall once again, and she said if you have any questions, you can ask one another. And so the real subject now knows that the other person in the room has just done the experiment that he or she is in. And so, in fact, that gave us an opportunity to measure whether the subject would ask for help from a peer. And as you can see here, once again, we see that when people are reminded of money, they work longer and harder on this challenging and, in fact, impossible task relative to subjects who are not reminded of money or they're reminded of a low money condition. So here they had the opportunity to ask for help from a peer, and the person was in the room with them at the same time. So it was a much easier, kind of a lower bar in order to ask for help. But yet we see the same pattern that we saw before. And now we started to move on then. We had a nice series of studies on money and helping, but we believed that the psychology of money was much bigger than money and helping. And so we moved on to trying to understand how people dealt with social situations in general. So what happens in this experiment is subjects come into the lab individually, and they sit down at a desk. That desk has on it a very thick stack of questionnaires. So thick that I know that my subjects are going to be working on them for basically as long as I let them. The subjects sit down at the desk, and we ask them to fill out the questionnaires. And in the back of their desk, about 1.5 feet away, is a computer monitor. And for 4 minutes, when they're working on those filler questionnaires and their heads are bent down, that computer monitor shows a plain PC desktop. After 4 minutes, on pops the screensaver. And if our subjects have been randomly assigned to the money condition, their screensaver looks something like this. It shows pictures of hard currency floating underwater. This is a commercially available screensaver that if you go to the website of the screensaver company, it says our most popular screensaver ever. I don't know who is downloading these, but I imagine people in the business world, I have no idea. It's fun, it's cool, and you can change the currencies. So when I was a professor at UBC in Vancouver, we used beautiful, colorful Canadian currency. When I traveled to Europe and do experiments there, we use the euro. When I go to China, we use renminbi and so on. So it's quite a fun little screensaver. And our subjects, with their heads bent down, can see the screensaver just on their visual periphery. And none of them report recognizing or knowing that the screensaver is on. Now, if our subjects had been randomly assigned to our non-money condition, we had them looking at pictures, or we had images of fish swimming underwater be the screensaver that flashed in the corner of their desk. Now, it turns out when we have our lab meetings, we realized that maybe the fish wasn't going to be the best control condition, but there are reasons that we used it. And so we wanted to include a second control condition to kind of really make sure we were going to be able to interpret the effects that we were seeing. And so we included a second control condition in which there's no screensaver. So I've got one money condition and two non-money conditions. And then what we did is, the experimenter came in and said, okay, your next task is a get-to-know-you conversation with someone down the hall. She said, I'm going to go get that other person down the hall, why don't you grab some chairs, bring them together, and get ready for the conversation? And we measured, at that point, how close the subject put the two chairs as a sign of their preferred intimacy with that other person. And so what we saw then is that when people had been reminded of money in the earlier part of that experiment, they put more physical distance between themselves and someone that they were trying to get to know. So they sat farther away from this person, and you can imagine that might feel sort of standoffish. Now our two control conditions looked exactly the same, so that was nice for us to see. And so here we're starting to get the pattern that when people are reminded of money, the effects on their psyche are much, much bigger than simply helping. In another experiment, we wanted to ask how people would perform work tasks. And in particular, we wanted to ask whether people would like to do them alone or together. And so we have the screensaver manipulation being used just as I described before. And then the experimenter comes in and says, via random assignment, you actually get to choose how the next task goes. And in fact, you're going to be doing an advertising development task, and you get to choose. Do you want to do it alone, or do you want to do it with someone who's down the hall? Now, presumably, if they want to do it with someone else, that's going to be sharing the workload. I mean, you would assume that the other person's going to contribute something. And so you get to share the workload, but it means you actually have to be with somebody and interact with them. So if you're choosing to work alone, then you're saying, I'd rather take on more work just to not have to be around other people. And so we simply measured whether people wanted to work alone or whether they wanted to work with someone else. And what we see is that it turns out undergraduates overwhelmingly would like to work with someone else on a boring psychology task. And that's what you see in these bars here, except for not if they've been reminded of money, then that flips completely. So here you see 80% of our student participants say, I'd rather work with somebody else on this advertising development task. But if they've been reminded of money, about 75% of them say, no, I would rather work alone. So they're saying, I'd rather do more work just to have to avoid hanging out with someone else. So now we're really getting the feeling that reminders of money change people's behaviors in big ways. And the last experiment in this series is about how people spend their leisure time. And we thought to ourselves, my graduate students and I thought, okay, so we've shown that when people are reminded of money, they sort of want to be alone and not so helpful. But you know what? Every single experiment that we conducted had to do with how people coped with someone else that they don't know, a stranger. We thought, maybe when people are reminded of money, it kicks in something different about strangers and friends. Like maybe they want to be near their friends and loved ones, and there's just strangers they don't want to be around. So we thought we better test this. So we wanted to understand how people wanted to spend their leisure time as a vehicle for us to understand whether they want to be close to friends and family. And so subjects come into the lab in this experiment and sit down at a desk, and again are filling out lots of boring paperwork. And above the desk is a poster. Now apparently people don't think it's weird to have a poster of hard currency up if you work in a business school. But we had a poster, again, beautiful, colorful Canadian currency up if our subjects were randomly assigned to the money condition. Or we had one of these two beautiful, colorful posters up if they'd been assigned to one of the non-money conditions. So now our subjects are being, again, very tacitly, very subtly reminded of money. And then we say, well, we're here in the marketing department, and we really want to know how people spend their leisure time. And so we gave them a list of options for things that they could be doing on upcoming days and weekends. And little did they know, each of the options had two choices, one of which was an activity to do by oneself, or there were activities to do with other people, friends, family, dating partners, and so on. And so, for example, we asked our subjects to think about, do you want to rent movies at home alone, or do you want to go to a theater? Do you want to go out to a cafe with a friend, or curl up with a book at home? Do you want to go to the spa by yourself, or would you like to go to an amusement park with your friends? We also had, you could take 4 private cooking lessons, or you'd have a group of 4 at your house to take a cooking lesson. And so we made sure that all the activities were equated in terms of the amount of money that they would be costing and so on. And what we really, of course, wanted to know is how do people prefer to spend time? They prefer to spend time alone or with friends and family and loved ones. And so here on the y-axis, it's the number of activities chosen for the self alone. And And what you see is that when people are reminded of money, they choose more leisure activities for the self. And mimicking what we'd see in the other experiments, choosing to be alone rather than with other people, even when those other people are friends and family. And so now we had a very clear understanding that when people are reminded of money, it was changing the way they dealt with their social relationships. Now, happily and luckily, people have been excited about the research and wanting to understand really how it works, maybe in other contexts. And so a graduate student at Stanford in the psychology department took some of these ideas to India. Now, it turns out asking whether these effects would occur in India is a really important question because India is a prototypical communal country. It's characterized by desires to have warm and harmonious ties and to be respectful of other people. In contrast, America is much more of an individualistic country, driven by market forces, democracy, and desire for, in some sense, to sort of get ahead as opposed to simply getting along. And so we really wondered if this PhD student's work in India would show similar effects, and in fact it did. So the student named Savani took the reminders of money paradigms. So he asked some people to think about money by doing the descrambling task, and he asked other people to think about neutral concepts. And these are young adults in Mumbai, India. And then he gave them what's called a moral responsibility, questionnaire. And it turns out it has 6 items, and these are they. So you see that when people are reminded of money, Indian young adults, they say that they're less likely to be morally responsible for other people. They don't want to lend a hand for unimportant events, and they don't even want to lend a hand for important events, like a ride to the hospital or providing comfort during surgery. And so even in a collectivistic culture, we see similar effects occurring as we've been seeing here in America. A young woman named Shreya was a 13-year-old teenager, and her parents subscribed to the journal Science, and she read the article that I just described some studies from. She wondered if this would work with adolescents, and so Shreya decided to use the paradigm with some of her adolescent peers. And so she gave them, again, that descrambling task paradigm, and then she asked them, hey, if you got $100, how much of that would you be willing to donate to charity? And then she asked them, if your classmate needed help with his or her homework, would you be willing to volunteer your time? And if so, how much? Shreya did this for her school science fair, and she ended up taking the project not only from her school science fair, but to the district, to the region, to the state of Indiana, and all the way to the Discover Channel Science Fair Nationals. I'm very proud of her. And she found, in fact, that when adolescents, young teenagers are reminded of money, they say that they would be less generous with a donation, or they would be less generous with money that they'd recently received, and they would spend less time helping a peer with his or her homework. Okay, so we wanted to take a look then and kind of understand at a little more granular level what might be accounting for some of the behaviors that we've been seeing, and we decided to look at something called egocentrism. It turns out in academia, we do this all the time. There are 2 terms that basically mean the same thing. And so here, and I'll use them interchangeably, perspective taking is the opposite of egocentrism. And so when people perspective take, they can see things from the eyes of another person. It turns out good relationship partners do this all the time. When you're egocentric, you can only see things from your own perspective. And so we wanted to understand if this mentality could explain what was going on with the construct of money. So we give people this task. Their task is to take an index card. They sit across from the experimenter, and the experimenter says, as quickly but as accurately as possible, please draw the following symbols. And it turns out that symbols are ones that have a direction to them, so you'll see in just a minute. We want to understand whether people write those symbols on the index card so that the experimenter can read them, and that's called perspective taking, or so that the self could read them if they held the card out from their head. So this is a self-oriented E. This man here is drawing an E on his forehead. It's easier for him to do, but it is actually, we give our subjects index cards. I want to be clear here. We're not having people write on their foreheads. But here, Adam Galinsky, he's a super famous researcher at Northwestern. He's drawing a self-oriented E on his forehead. Now, his collaborator is drawing an other-oriented E. This is good perspective taking, but it's also tougher to do. You can imagine, right? Okay, so I think as an academic, everything I do has real-world relevance, but I'm not really sure that everybody in the world would agree with that. But here's a case where I wasn't completely sure that I'd ever see a real-world analog to this task, and I did. Do you know who this woman is? This woman's name is Ashley Davis, and Ashley Davis apparently got beaten up by a gang of black men leaving a John McCain rally in the months leading up to the presidential election in 2008. It turned out her story was fishy for a variety of reasons, but the fishiest reason is that she said that those men carved a B for Barack into her cheek, except for what she forgot to do is she forgot to perspective take, and she drew an egocentric B into her own cheek when she beat herself up and gave herself a black eye. Yeah, I'm not sure you can see the distinction, but she's got a B here that's a backwards B. She failed a perspective take. Okay. So real-world example of what I'm about to tell you. All right. I know, Looney Tunes, right? Right. So here's what we did. We stopped passersby on the streets of Chicago, and we asked them to do one thing for us. Take an index card and draw in one of 4 conditions. Either draw an S or the dollar sign, or a C or the cent sign. And it turns out what's beautiful about this little manipulation is that the S and the C are the fundamental basis for both of those types of symbols. And of course, to make it a monetary symbol, you add a slash to it. And so that directional part is the same for these participants and these participants. But of course, their mental state of thinking about money versus an S is totally different. And so we wanted to know, how did they draw those symbols so that the person standing across from them could read them, or so that they themselves could read them? So egocentrically or perspective taking. And this is what you see. When people are asked to draw a dollar sign, they overwhelmingly make it an egocentric direction compared to an S, and a similar comparison for the cent sign versus the letter C. So people fail to perspective take when they're thinking about money. Now, very quickly, I want to tell you about an experiment that we tried to do, or we did, that tried to get people to overcome this egocentric bias, and it went like this. We used a maze task where this person is a Confederate, and this person is the naive subject. And the naive subject's job is to guide a blindfolded, a blindfolded Confederate, or here she's got her eyes closed, guide her finger through a maze, through a series of verbal instructions. So there are several choice points in this maze where the subject has an opportunity to perspective take or fail to perspective take. And so the subject might say, go up, oh, I'm sorry, I meant down, that's your down, 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 left, left, oh, I meant right, that's your right, and so on. And so you can measure how well people do at this task, how good are they at perspective taking. And we did it under one of kind of 6 conditions. We reminded some people of money or not via the screensaver task. And then on top of that, we told our subjects the following. One group was a control condition, and they didn't get any kind of instructions about the task other than basically what to do. A second group we gave them what's called a social incentive. We said, doing really, really well on this task means that you're probably an excellent relationship partner because you can see things from someone else's perspective. It turns out this is actually totally true. Really good relationship partners do this all the time. We gave other people, though, a monetary incentive, and we said, if you can do really well on this task, we're going to give you a quarter for every correct direction that you give your partner. So now we've got 2 incentive conditions, a social incentive condition and a money incentive condition, and a control condition. We wanted to understand that how the subject would perform. So here we've got a control condition, and what you see is that when subjects are reminded of money, they show more egocentrism. So it's just like we'd seen before. When subjects are told that if they do really well on the task, that shows that they're an amazing relationship partner, that has absolutely no effect. So people reminded of money are still very bad at the task relative to people who are not reminded of money. But when we tell people that doing well on the task means that you're going to get some money for it, now our subjects who are reminded of money can perform well. So people reminded of money seem to be able to correct their egocentric biases, but only if they're given the incentive of earning more money. Sort of a sad conclusion from that experiment. Okay. And in the very last set of experiments that I'm going to tell you about, we really wanted to push the envelope and ask ourselves, when people are in self-sufficient mode, kind of ultimately, what is that like? And how can we really understand this? And we decided to put people through painful experiences as a way to understand how money can change the human psyche. And so here's what we did. These 6 next experiments were all conducted in China. And in this first experiment, our subjects came into the lab, and half of them were randomly assigned to a finger dexterity task in which they counted out hard currency. We have them here counting out $100 bills in Chinese currency, which is about the US equivalent of a $15 bill. So imagine if we had something like a $15 bill and you'd be counting out 80 of those. Better? Is there a buzzing noise? Okay. And our subjects were not reminded of money. We also told them this was a finger dexterity task, and we told them that their job was to count up pieces of paper. Okay. So we wanted to understand how self-sufficiency and this notion of being separate from others and not needing someone else, how that would relate to the experience of pain. And in the first experiment, we put people through what's considered to be a socially painful experience. And so here's what happens. We now have another division of our subjects where all of them are going to go online and play a virtual game with 2 virtual partners. Now the game, in fact, is something that's rigged by us, the experimenters, and we rig it in one of 2 ways. We rig it so that the game goes normally and the participant playing the game feels like nice and socially included with his or her online partners. Or we rig it so that subjects feel socially excluded, so that the way that that game plays out for them is that the other people are ignoring them. And I'm going to show you what that looks like next. So this is the normal play condition. And what happens is this is you, and your job is to pass a ball back and forth between you and 2 partners. That's it. It's a pretty elementary task, and obviously people can do it just fine. So you're this little duck-like hand here, and you, in the normal play, are just passing in and getting the ball back. However, if you're randomly assigned to the social rejection condition, your little hand simply watches back and forth as these people have a really good time with the ball. This is it seems like in the world of enriched video games and 3D everything, this impoverished task, it's shocking to me the intense impact it can have on people's feelings and their cognitions. And so there have been many, many, many dozens of papers that have used this task, and we know that for most people, most of the time, this rejection task feels pretty bad. But remember, we've had some people reminded of money, and that was our question. So right after they did one of these 2 games, we said to them, hey, we want to know about that game. How did that feel to you? And we asked them 9 different questions about feeling valued, feeling respected, or feeling alone and rejected. Okay? And we called that a measure of social pain. So here's what we see. Now, this counting paper condition is like a control condition. So on the y-axis here, you have feelings of social pain or upsettedness. And you see that when people are socially excluded, they felt worse than when people were not socially excluded. That makes sense. That's a replication of everything we already know. But when people had been earlier counting money, now getting the experience of social rejection didn't hurt them. They said they felt fine. In fact, they felt the same as their counterparts who'd been socially included in that game. So we had this experiment now showing that when people are reminded of money, the circumstances that would be painful don't feel painful. Now we decided to push the boundaries and test this not only with social pain, but in the physical pain system as well, because we know that the social pain system essentially piggybacked off the physical pain system in the evolution of modern human psyches. And so now we have the same manipulation as you just saw before. Half of our subjects count out paper, and half of our subjects count out slips of hard currency. Now in this experiment, we have half of our subjects now putting their hands in warm water, and this is our control condition. Another half of our subjects put their hands in extremely hot water. I mean, hotter than any hot tub you've ever been in. Hot water. And we then want to know, how does that feel to you? And we have them tell us how painful that circumstance is. Of course, our prediction is that we're going to see something similar to what we saw in the earlier experiment with social pain, and that is in fact what we see. So here, our control condition, subjects who'd been not reminded of money experienced the hot water as significantly more painful than the warm water. Our subjects reminded of money don't show this effect. So they show a much muted effect, whereby if they've been reminded of money, the otherwise painful experience of the hot water doesn't really bother them all that much. So now we have 2 experiments about money blunting the experience of pain. And we decided to flip it around a little bit. Now we wanted to know, when people feel painful, how do they feel about money? So we wanted to use social pain and physical pain. So here in this experiment, We have subjects come into the lab and they meet a group of other people and they have a little interaction and they go away into these little small separate rooms and they take a piece of paper and write down who they wanted to work with on an upcoming task. Sort of who do they like the most. This experimenter collects all those slips of paper, goes into her room, throws them away, takes out her random assignment sheet and goes into the subject's rooms, and if they're randomly assigned to the acceptance condition, she says, okay, this is really weird and this never happens, but everybody chose you for the next task, and so logistically this just doesn't work, and I'll have to think of something else for us to do. In the meanwhile, here are these questionnaires. If our subjects are assigned to the rejection condition, she says the same script, she's equally confused, but this time it's because no one chose you, and this just never happens before, so logistically we can't go on, and I'll figure out what else to do. In the meanwhile, here's some questionnaires. So our questionnaires then have to do with how people feel about money, and we wanted to know about their desire for money, and we used 3 items to test that. So one is drawing the size of a coin. It turns out there's research from the 1940s that suggests that when people represent things as larger in their minds, that means they want it more. So hungry people, if you ask them to draw the size of a hamburger, it's going to be giant compared to non-hungry people. And similarly, people who want money draw coins and represent bills as larger than people who don't care about money. So we asked them to draw the size of a $1 coin in China. We also had 7 beautiful things in life, and we asked them which of those that they'd give up permanently to be a millionaire. And last, we gave them money for participating, and then we asked them to donate, if they'd like to a local orphanage. And so I put these all on one axis so you can see the results together, but you see that there's an effect of the condition on all 3. So that when people are feeling socially rejected, they represent the size of coins as perceptually larger. They're willing to trade more beautiful things in life to be a millionaire, and they actually donate less of their money to the local orphanage, suggesting that when people feel social pain, they want money more. So we want to do this in the physical pain realm, and this time we don't put their hands in hot water. We actually mentally activate the idea of physical pain for some of our subjects, or we activate neutral concepts for others of our subjects. And then, quite simply, we asked them to do something extremely similar to what I just showed you. How big do coins in our society seem? So we gave them a sheet with circles and said, pinpoint to which one is the 50-cent coin to the dollar coin, and so on. And then in this task, we had them self-nominate beautiful things in life that they themselves love, which typically were like my iPod, my cell phone, my girlfriend, my dog. And then we said, which of these would you permanently trade to be a millionaire? And once again, you see, when people are in a painful mode, this time as they're thinking about physical pain, they want money more. They represent the size of coins as being larger, and now they're willing to trade more self-nominated beautiful things in life to be a millionaire. And in the last 2 experiments I'm going to tell you about, we wanted to understand what it's like to think about money that you don't have anymore. So if money is a resource, and money is giving people this self-sufficient feeling, then what does it feel like to think, oh my gosh, I don't have as much of it as I used to? And so for this experiment, some of our subjects come into the lab and they're given a calendar, and we say, to the best of your abilities, write out the weather for the past month. And I think we can all agree Sunday, Monday, last week are memorable, and you could draw out the weather. Others of our subjects are given a calendar, and they're asked to think about their monetary expenditures for the month. I mean gum, grocery store trips, a new backpack, a plane ticket to see mom and dad, and so on. So people write down the money that they've spent. And now we do exactly as we did in the first 2 experiments in this package. And so we have people either playing the online task and feeling socially included, or playing the online task and feeling excluded. We just wanted to see, how did that feel for you? How painful was that? You saw that before. And here's what we see. Okay, now when people are reminded of the money they don't have, painful experiences feel worse. So here we see in our control condition, it feels bad to be socially excluded. But over here, when you think about the money that you don't have, it feels worse. Now this painful experience of being socially rejected is even more painful. So we wanted to do it again in the physical pain realm to see what we really had going on. And now we ask people again to think about money or weather for the past month. And then we asked them to do the hot water or the warm water task, just as we'd done earlier. And then we said, how painful does this feel to you? And just as you might be suspecting, we see that physical pain feels worse when subjects are thinking about the money that they don't have anymore. They're feeling not self-sufficient, and they're feeling weak and vulnerable, and as a consequence, painful experiences are even more painful. So, in sum, I've tried to tell you today about the research that my colleagues and I do, understanding the psychology of money, and these are the 4 takeaway points. One is that money changes the way that people give help and ask for help, and in specific, when people are reminded of money, they are less helpful towards other people, but they also request less help for themselves. Reminders of money change the way people approach social interactions, and in particular, it drives people to have a desire to be alone and to put more physical distance between themselves and someone else. We also saw that money reminders lead people to be stuck in their own frame of reference. They're not very good at getting out of their own mind and seeing something from someone else's perspective. Of course, we did see one exception to that. It's as when people could be thinking about getting more money. And last, we saw that reminders of money blunt the experience of social and physical pain, and that when we focus people on the money that they don't have, that exacerbates the experience of social and physical pain. With that, thank you.
We'll be taking questions for a few minutes, and then when we're done with that, we have cookies and punch down here. We figured that if we brought them down here, you'd have to come down and get a chance to read the talk with our speaker as well. So
that's right. I may eat them all before you come down, so you better hurry.
Yeah.
Questions? Come on, I know y'all have questions. Yes?
How did the statistics talking about the adolescent person who was looking at how many affected them, how did that compare to adult statistics on the same test?
Great question. So her question is, essentially, what we would call effect sizes. So in other words, was the effect on adolescents as powerful as an effect as we were seeing in our college students and young adults and community sample? And in fact, it is. So you see that the effect looks extremely similar among adolescents as it does with adults. And adolescents probably in America have had enough experience with money that might be the case. But it's a great question. Other questions? Yes?
Going back to when you were having people thinking about their expenses from the past month.
Right.
Have you done any experiments where you were having people think of like the next payday or paydays to come?
No, that's a really nice idea. So what's your hypothesis then? Does that look does that look the same?
Well, I'm guessing it'd be the exact opposite.
Exact opposite. Very good. That's my hypothesis too. So his question is, you get people to think about the money they've spent from the past month. What happens if you orient them towards the future and money coming into the bank account? And we would predict, same as this gentleman here, that when people are in that task, it looks like when I have them counting out hard currency, because they're sort of thinking about money coming into themselves, and you would predict it would be the opposite of thinking about money going out. It's a nice manipulation. Others? One more. Gotta go for threes. Everything's better in threes. Yes?
I get the impression that psychological testing involves deception and manipulation.
Well, certainly manipulation.
And if I felt that was the nature of psychological testing, I don't think I would ever volunteer to be subjected to it.
Uh-huh. Okay. And your question?
So you need a sort of naive and persons who are easily led, or
I'm not sure that we need naive persons who are easily led, but the role of experimental realism is really important in these experiments because we want people to be invested and involved in the situation at hand. And so we construct situations that have a lot of richness and a lot of descriptive detail so that they feel like psychologically they're really engaged in what's going on. We think that this is a very nice analog to what happens in modern day life, where the use of money is oftentimes tacit. It's something about which people give very little attention. And it's part of the theory here that when people are operating with money out in the naturalistic environment, that's mimicking very much what we're having people do in the lab. So a finger dexterity task might look something like when you take out $2 or $3 bills to make sure that you can get on the bus. And so people are focused on getting the bus, getting to work on time, not tripping on the stairs, and that money is there as a small reminder. And so for us, these contexts are important to create this setting that we think has a nice analog to what happens outside the lab with naturalistic uses of money. Any last one? Yes, Dick.
I was wondering what you would think of a dating situation where women go Dutch. It would seem, according to what you were saying here, that women would like that less because they think of money more, and men would like it more because they think of money less, I would guess.
Wait, I'm not sure I understood that. In a dating context, is it better for one, is it better for
Would it be better to go Dutch for now, or the man pays the way on a date?
You know, I think it's, you know, to my mind, if you were thinking about this in a romantic setting, and when I work with couples and I do some advising with romantic partners, I think it's important that they don't have the idea of money be at the forefront. So it doesn't really matter who pays, but it's when you make a big deal out of it either way. So, no, I'll get it, no, I'll get it, no, I'll get it. That really focuses people on money, and I think that can introduce the construct to be maybe a heavier weight on what's going to happen next in their interactions. I think it's probably, I'm not sure that it's a big deal if they go Dutch or if he pays or if she pays, but just to kind of do it in that setting and move on and get on with their relationship to kind of make sure they're not in that market pricing mode for too long. Okay, cookies and punch? All right, thanks everybody.